Hey, Brent Porcio, TopVelocity.net. We're going to do a class here on the misconceptions of developing or designing pitches. Like, how do we actually create spin? How do we create movement with that spin? How do we put velocity on that movement with spin? And one in particular, we're going to talk about the misconception of how everyone believes it's influenced by their wrist or the hand, and it really has more to do with the whole kinetic chain. So I'm going to use two good examples to help us understand this. Obviously, we have a young pitcher and an older pitcher, and this is a pro pitcher. So it really helps us see the differences, because at a younger level, you're not going to see as good of technique, and at the older level, the higher level, you're going to see better technique. So it'll create a bigger comparison or better comparison, because you're going to see a real difference between the two. So I want to start first with just some basics on how pitches move. So basically you have some terms like spin axis. So wherever the ball is spinning, if we drew a line down the middle of it, that'd be the spin axis, right? So the spin rate is how fast it's spinning. Spin efficiency is how well its true spin. It's spinning on that axis. I'm not really going to go into that, but I'm going to go more into spin axis, spin rate, and how do we influence that into creating certain types of pitches. So for example, spin axis has to do really with not so much the arm slot, it's really the ulnar to radial deviation. So it's really where the fingers are at release. If the fingers are off on the side, then we can get a more horizontal spin axis. It also can go into spin efficiency, but we're not going to talk about that. And if we want a more vertical spin axis, obviously the fingers are more on the top. So it's basically when the ball comes out, what's dictating that spin. It's going to have a lot to do with arm slot to ulnar radial deviation, where the wrist is, okay? And then understand, arm slot is dependent on trunk orientation, pelvis orientation. It works its way down to the beginning of the chain. Here's the thing, when coaches are working with pitchers and they find that they're getting, say, behind the ball and they're not getting good spin, because what creates good spin? Pronation, acceleration. Pronation is when the thumb turns down, supination when it turns back. So the acceleration of pronation, meaning the rotational movement of the wrist, is what dictates the spin. And a lot of people that's where the misconception lives. The misconception lives that we think that pitchers release the ball in extension. So the wrists, they believe, the misconception is pitchers flex and then extend the wrist to throw. Well, you are holding firm in the wrist, obviously, to keep the grip on the ball, but you aren't actually pushing down as much as you're turning over. So like a football, you're spinning. And the act of spinning, okay, it turns, even though you're still in flexion, it turns and it goes from a behind position to over the top position. So it creates the feeling of extension, but it's really pronation, rotation of the wrist, acceleration. So those who can spin faster creates more spin on the ball, like a football. Think of like a football, okay? Not only that, your velocity is driving it too. But the misconception is I have to get into extension. And we also know if you're throwing pitches with good break, like cutters, sliders, and even if we get into pronated or sinkers or arm side breaking pitches, we have to get pronated. So a lot of people say get on top of the ball. And this is where another misconception comes in. People believe getting on top of the ball is getting extended. Okay, it feels that way. I'm not saying it doesn't, but technically that's not what's happening. Getting on top of the ball means you're getting pronated. And if you're late to pronate, you're gonna be on the side of the ball, and it's gonna feel like ultimately you're too far behind the ball and not on top of the ball. But ultimately, to even understand this better, getting on top of the ball means your forearm position or your shoulder is more internally rotated. Getting behind the ball, kind of pushing the ball, is when your forearm position or your shoulder is more externally rotated or more vertical. And I'm going to show you that here, okay? So where it's incorrectly coached is coaches see this release and they try to teach you to extend your wrist or push down or follow through or pull down. That's not actually how it works. It's actually your arm needs to turn over and your thumb needs to turn down, pronate. That's actually what needs to happen. So I'm going to show you an example of this. So if we take this young pitcher to the left and we take him to foot strike here, okay, he stays closed. Oops, sorry. He stays closed good. And if we take the pro pitcher here, okay, he also stays closed good. What you will see though, you'll see a little bit more effort to drive, definitely less effort to drive. So he's still turning here. And that's going to have a lot to do with where the wrist is. I'm not going to get into that. If you want to learn how the kinetic chain works to influence the end, the best way, because there's ways you can influence without using the kinetic chain, you need to get into top velocity and you need to learn all the mechanics to get there. But watch this pitcher on the left, okay? Once he gets to release, let's take him to the perfect point of release right there, okay? So we can see his release point here, okay? And then let's take the pro pitcher to his release point. I want to get at the same point, okay? So you can see fingers, the ball is just coming off the fingers, ball is just coming off the fingers. Okay, here's the significance here. If we take our angle tool and we draw the angle of this, okay, and then we take our angle tool here and we draw the angle of this, okay, we can see 33 degrees to 42 degrees, so almost 10 degrees more, so basically a more vertical forearm position. So think about how that affects where the fingers are on the ball. And here's the thing, a lot of pitch design stuff takes the back camera to see where the hand is. Well, that's fine, so you can see if it's on the side of the ball or around the ball, because if it's on the side of the ball supinated, that's obviously going to be a pitch that wants to run that way. And if it's more pronated on this side of the ball, it's going to be a pitch that wants to run that way. Obviously, a pitch too that's going to have more spin, you want to see the fingers starting to get more on this side of the ball. But you really won't understand why that's happening if you don't take this angle and you understand the forearm position. So some with the forearm position more vertical than more horizontal, you're going to see that person is more in this orientation, right? They're more behind the ball, maybe even side of the ball, because it's going to be harder to fully pronate. And you can try that. So remember, pronation is thumb back, or supination is thumb back, pronation is thumb forward. Put your elbow forward and forearm directly up. Place your hand on the ball, and now try to, from that position, pronate. You can see you really can't turn the wrist much more than that. And that's not going to be much pronation. But if you now change that, take the elbow up and horizontal the forearm, and then place the fingers on the ball and then pronate, you're all the way on the side of the ball, okay? So you go from pronating with the forearm up, you can barely pronate. Then with the forearm horizontal, parallel, you pronate and you fully pronate. So this pitcher is going to be forced in that release point to supinate or struggle to get pronated or get on top of the ball. As opposed to this pitcher, he's going to be more on top of the ball and more easy to pronate. So you can throw pronated pitchers. In this pro pitcher, there's a really good pronated splitter. It's one of the best in the game. This pitcher here struggles to throw pronated pitches because he hasn't developed a more horizontal forearm position. Okay, so instead of teaching pitchers that, okay, let's get into the glove and let's tuck more, extended here to help me get to this position, you have to teach the pitcher that would get the arm actually to internally rotate earlier. So things like that, a quick fix like that could be shortening the arm path. That's what they typically do as a quick fix, is shorten the arm path to get there quicker. But that can hurt velocity. It can also hurt your arm. Ideally, you want to delay the trunk, separate better, which separate hips and shoulders, give your arm more time to then get into position and get internally rotated early. It's also way healthier for your arm if you're giving your arm more time as opposed to trying to shorten it and rushing your arm. Okay. So, but once again, if you want to learn more of this, this is in the TopVelocity program. This is you learning our biomechanical system and where you are. So, for example, if I have this pro pitcher doing this, to tell him or to try to teach him to get on top of the ball through cutters, through sliders, or obviously more downward braking sliders, I probably could potentially hurt him. Because once again, let's go to the more vertical forearm position and let's try to pronate. You can't pronate there. And if you're throwing really hard and your wrist wants to fly around in supination and you're trying to fight that to pronate and you're at end range, this is where you can start straining your forearm and start having forearm issues. So there's pitchers here that throw very hard and probably are more vertical positions. Like I can think of a lot of major league starters that have that. They're late to get internally rotated. Then what happens is if they get even more tired and that gets even later and later and later and they get more vertical, those pronated pitchers they're trying to throw start injuring their forearm and they start having forearm strains, which potentially can lead to Tommy John surgery. So what's the lesson here? The lesson here is you've got to learn when it comes to getting on top of the ball and creating good pronation acceleration and throwing those hard-breaking cutters and sliders. It has more to do with the timing of your trunk to arm path and getting your arm path to pronate or internally rotate early, which will then help it or make it a lot easier to pronate early, which will create that feeling of being on top of the ball and create those hard-breaking sliders and cutters, and also give you the potential to throw anything arm side as well. And it's in your mechanics, it's not in the wrist position. And if you try to do it in the wrist position, you're just going to either fail or fail and hurt yourself. So I hope that helps. If you have any questions and you want to learn more about this and how to design and develop pitches through the kinetic chain as opposed to from a misguided position, which is in your wrist movements and positions, check out the TopVelocity programs. You know, we can take you through all of them. So you probably just need advice on how to start moving through them. So reach out to us. We have some remote coaching. Go to topvelocity.net/remote coaching and we'll help you through the process.